Welcome to the State of the Nation. As you know, we have discussed international politics a lot, and as well as the South African scene, the politics, economics. And right now, the world changed. We were expecting a nice slow start to the new year, but we haven't got one of those. We saw what happened in Venezuela, and now we are moving on to another hotspot, and that is going to be Iran, and somebody who's able to not only talk about Iran, but to talk about South Africa and where we are. And I'm very excited today that we are going to be talking to the one and only Dr. Iraj Abedian. I've been so excited to get this interview together. But before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, Pace Car Rental. They help keep us on the air. Please, if you need to hire a car, go to Pace, use our code SONA, S-O-N-A, and you can get a discount off your next car hire. And we want to thank you for doing that, and a thank you to Pace. And while you've got your other browser open listening to me, you might as well subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Our guest today, a former professor of economics at UCT, was the chief economist at Standard Bank, and he's now the chief economist at Pan-African Research, the one and only Dr. Iraj Abidyan. Iraj, I don't know what's taken us so long, but welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity, and greetings to our viewers and listeners.
Now, let's start off with, the sort of the one part which a lot of people will know already because you've been on a few platforms. You were born in Iran and came to South Africa as a teenager following the revolution. So you obviously have some knowledge of what Iran is and how it operates, and more than just the odd little link with the place. Tell us what is going on in Iran.
Well, Mark, at the moment, I regret to say that literally a massacre is happening. The regime, or the government, Islamic Republic government, has cordoned off the country, cut it off for the 5th consecutive day from the international communication. Internet is completely blocked out. And they have engaged, as of yesterday afternoon, when the facts came out, not the speculations, I'll come back to it. As of yesterday, they have recorded by their own internal memo, which was published, 12,000 dead, executed, literally from close range. And of course, as we all know, over the past 15 or 16 days, because of the ever-expanding uprising culminating in a revolutionary kind of cross-country movement, the regime got into a total panic, and hospitals are packed. If 12,000, which is according to a memo that was leaked out, and you can go Iran International Media House put it out yesterday, an editorial statement based on the statement that they received from the revolution in regards to the National Security Council, reporting of their achievements, so to speak, that they have killed 12,000 in body bags. Then there are snippets around the globe on the web showing that literally people are piled up. I regret to say, and I must control my emotions, like sausages that people must go and find their loved ones. Mark, it might come to an absolute shocking news that to collect the body that they have shot from close range against people who were barehanded. These are mostly young, the majority below 30 years old, a lot of teenagers, literally 16, 17, 15, and a few kids. But be as it may, when you want to collect the body, you have to pay for the bullet. It's humongous amounts, and families are left in not just mourning and distress, but also financially the so-called salt on the wound. So this is the nature of this regime that is becoming now open, and yet it's not ended. Hospitals are packed. Yesterday afternoon, 4,000 Iranian doctors and medical practitioners of different orientations. They had a joint statement appealing to the global health fraternity that these people need help. There are, if 12,000 have been killed by their own admission, a multiple of that, possibly 50, 60, 70,000, nobody knows. Don't hold me to it. But they are in hospitals, short of resources, short of medicine. And last week, in the middle of all this, as the wounded were going to hospitals, these revolutionary guards threw tear gas into a hospital. Not by mistake, intentionally chased the so-called demonstrators into hospitals on two locations, or in two locations. This is just in the 21st century, Mark. I submit we may well, in 30, 40 years, retrospectively, define what has happened the past week in Iran and as happening now as the 21st century's Holocaust, for a different reason by different religious groups or ideological groups.
Now, that ideology is that you talk of is that since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Iran has been a theocracy, but it's not necessarily an uncontested terrain, the theocracy itself, if I have it correctly. It's not like the country is 100% behind these ayatollahs, and that sort of is the problem that seems to rear its head every now and again. What is the attitude towards the theocracy within Iran?
Mark, the reality is, if you look at the statistics, if you look at facts, the reality is that there are two identities for the control of Iran, socio-politically speaking, that have been at loggerhead since 1979. One is a particular radical minute minority of an Islamic Shia-oriented theocracy, which defines itself as the only one and only religious leadership of the Islamic world, not of the Shias, not of the Sunnis, of the entire Islamic world. That is its God-given mission. They see themselves at that, and they have to achieve this because they've been born to make that happen. The previous, or one of the previous presidents of the Republic, Ahmadinejad, who happens to be the only so-called non-Ayatollah or a normal engineer, believe it or not, professor at the university, stood at the United Nations General Assembly and claimed that he had a halo around him because he is born to accelerate the dominance of this particular theocratic philosophy on the globe. Now, that is a particular, narrowly defined, extremely radical, extremely ruthless the interpretation of Islam. Iran is not like that. Iran is a very, very diverse society, has been at the cross-section of 3,000 years of cultural fusion, human rights, a society that first declared in written historic accounts the first statement of human rights, most of which already adopted by the United Nations. It sees itself as a melting pot of cultures, music, creativity, commerce, scientific discovery, etc., 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 and does not see itself as being superior. It sees itself as inclusive, as a fusion of cultures and orientations, philosophically, scientifically, and culturally. It's made of 11 tribal background, regionally, and yet they all coexist. They have learned to learn from each other, celebrate each other's strengths, and coexist peacefully. Now comes 1979 or prior to that, and Iran becomes the victim of global geopolitical contestation of the East and West, more specifically Jimmy Carter, and the Russian, or USSR at that time. And Jimmy Carter and backed by UK, France, and Germany decide to protect the West against the the Russian bear or USSR bear and surround it by Islamic fundamentalists. They had it in Afghanistan. They decided Iran has to now become on the altar of human rights to change from monarchy to an Islamic republic. The rest is history. Since then, the battle of these two cultures, Iranian culture, which is inclusive, which is human rights based, celebrates music, celebrates life, celebrates womanhood. On the other hand, this particular Islamic interpretation, which is narrow, dominant, and expansive in its, and they've been fighting. Every 3-4 years, there is an uprising on some or other grounds. Most importantly, right from the beginning, and I was already in Iran in 1979 when it happened. The first march happened when the women of Iran came out against the so-called hijab, or the cover that these guys wanted to put around women. And then since then, it hasn't stopped. The regime defined itself on two pillars. One, the suppression of women, and second, the elimination of the state of Israel. And since then, this battle has been going on up to today.
Now, before we jump into some of the issues that those issues that the leaders of the current leaders of Iran have engaged with, it's not like the Shah was a great force for good necessarily in Iran. There were some real excesses under the Shah, and by the time his demise arrived in 1979, he was a deeply unpopular character within the Iranian world. In many ways, you could say that he gave birth to the idea of anybody's got to be better than the Shah kind of thing. Tell us about the Shah and what he did while he was in charge of Iran.
Yeah, the Shah, the Shah report has got the story of two halves. The first half is a reformist, democratizing and modernizing a very, very backward society, a society that was very agriculture-based, land control, almost serfdom type of economy. And yet his father, not the Shah himself, his father had already began with Ataturk in Turkey to secularize the society, going from the clutches of religious leadership, so to speak, and engage in modernization, secularization, and rapid development of the society. His father had achieved a great deal of success, establishing universities, establishing railways, creating unification, creating a national army, creating security, and so on and so forth, roads, urbanization, and so on. But after the Second World War, when the Shah came, or his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, came in, he started a set of a 12-point socioeconomic reform, including land redistribution, access to education, access to health, women's rights, etc., etc., all of which was diametrically opposed to the religious establishment. They did not want equality of rights of men and women. They did not want women to get into the streets, never mind to be able to become the ministers and teachers and professors, etc., etc. They did not want to let control of the land ownership. Land ownership and land distribution was a major, major undermining of their power base, economically speaking. So I think a clash began in the 1950s already, late 50s, early 60s, between the religious establishment and the Shah. And the Shah had been seen as the lackey of the United States, who had been brought back after the Second World War. And that continued until Khomeini was basically exiled to Iraq, and the state there still fighting against the Shah. The Shah, in the meantime, created economic growth like never before. The oil price went up, the rapid growth, the rapid urbanization. And then I was a student of economics. This was a debate all the time we had in our groups. So the 1970s was the fastest growing, my apology, era in the Iranian modern history. Rapid growth, rapid urbanization, rapid industrialization, dramatic secularization on the socioeconomic side, but on the political side, the Shah was too slow to acknowledge or to do what it needs to be done, that you cannot educate people and keep them under control. You got to educate them, you got to liberalize them, you got to give them voice, you got to give them agency. And he and his family mostly were very slow in responding to the political needs of a rapidly growing middle class, rapidly educating, secularizing society, who did not want to be told what needs to be done. They want to be part of finding the solution. And that is where the Shah fell out of favor. And of course, at that time also, he was part of the global geopolitics of communist, socialists on the one hand, human rights on the other hand. Jimmy Carter got on the act. The USSR wasn't happy with him because he was non-aligned in many ways, and he was very nationalistic. So I think that is where by the late 70s, he had lost it. He had lost control of the pathway to transitioning an ancient, backward, mostly religious, ill-informed society to a modern, secular, industrializing society. And he lost the mission in the process, and he was not favored at all. At the same time, his security establishments engaged in what now could be called very excessive suppression of mostly intellectuals. And therefore, that did not sit well with the socioeconomic forces of domestic, and he was toppled down.
Now, of course, we can't miss the one part which has seemed to be forever seared in the mind of Iranians and people that watch, and that was the election of Mossadegh as the first democratically elected leader, and then the ousting of Mossadegh with the help of the CIA and MI5. Tell us briefly, Mossadegh, who was elected, if I'm not mistaken, in 1953, and seemed to be extremely popular, but then undermined by these foreign actors to the benefit of the Shah. From that moment on, there always seemed to be this question, and the anti-Westernism seemed to be building from that moment on.
Yeah, Mossadegh is a national figure, was a national figure, remains a national figure, a Swiss-educated lawyer who was familiar with the Europe's modernization, industrialization, and he believed, I think quite correctly, that Iran had all the resources to be equally modern, equally growing, equally high income as any of the European countries. And in fact, he believed that with the then newly discovered oil in Iran, Mossadegh believed that the nationalization of oil industry, which was under the control of the British at that time, British Petroleum, was the way to go. And he wanted to nationalize, he wanted to have a constitutional monarchy, as opposed to a monarchy which is authoritarian. And that is where Americans and the British didn't like this. The British didn't want to lose control of oil resources, and the Americans didn't like the concept of their man, which was the Shah, to be just a symbolic monarch, and the power should rest in the government, the prime minister, particularly a prime minister that they did not trust. He was Swiss trained. He was not brought in by America, and he was very articulate and very capable in mobilizing the then intellectual and relevant groups in Iran. So I think Mossadegh and the Americans got into a fight. Mossadegh for a different reason, and Mossadegh and the British got into a fight because of the nationalization of oil. And therefore, and the Shah himself didn't want to become a symbolic, he wanted to be like, at least like his father, or his, if not better. And he was a very ambitious individual. He saw himself as the king of kings, not just the king of kings. And with that kind of personality within that particular geopolitical configuration, the Americans did a coup d'etat with the help of CIA, basically kicked out Mossadegh and firmly stood behind the Shah to become an authoritarian monarch. And that is where, up to today, it remains an issue in the geopolitics of Iran.
Yeah, and you said the second part, and certainly the growing authoritarianism and the growing erratic behavior by the Shah. I must admit, I've watched this documentary a couple of times because it's got to be watched, and that is the Shah's famous celebration in the desert, where he used 1/3 of the Iranian GDP to throw a party for celebrating himself. Literally, he brought the finest chefs and the finest everything from all over the world to the desert to hold a party where he built literally temporary 5-star accommodation. Go and find it on YouTube. It's the most unbelievable documentary of somebody that's completely drunk with power. We hear lots of stories in Africa, but this was the precursor to a lot of those excesses, which sort of brings us to where we are now. There has been a fractious relationship between Iran and the Arab world, which goes back centuries. What is the relationship between Iran? The Arabs claim that the Iranians feel superior. The Iranians don't feel Arab, they feel Persian. Have I got it right? There was the Iran-Iraq war. There was all this kind of thing. What is the relationship in the region between Iran and the Arab world?
At the moment, Mark, the relationship is very tense, very unfriendly, very filled, replete with suspicion, plot and counterplots, for a different reason than when it was more or less the same under the Shah. Under the Shah, Iran was an uncontested largest army, modern, well-equipped, backed by the West, and seen as unchallengeable, purely on nationalistic grounds. Nothing more. There was no question of dominance. But Iran was modernizing. Iran was secularizing. The Arabs wanted to keep the old, mostly religious-centric theocracies in one way or another. And the Shah was absolutely none of it. He didn't want to have any of religious. It was a secular, very much modern secular society. So that was then the tension between the Arabs and the Iranian government, or the Iran broadly. It is true that Iran, as a society broadly, they see themselves as superior to the Arabs because of their historic, cultural, scientific, and other developments. And remember, a lot of these smaller Arab nations like Kuwait, like Yemen, these were part of the Persian Empire. They were not independent entities. They were at best a protectorate of the Iranian regime, going back thousands of years. So the Arabs had to choose. Do they want to be allied with the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, or do they want to be part of the Persian Empire? And some of them were part of the Persian Empire and identified themselves with that. Some of them saw themselves more as religious-centric Muslims, and therefore they associated themselves with the Ottoman Empire. So from those 200, 300 years ago, there's been a tension between the Persians, who were inclusive, who were culturally, they saw themselves as inclusive and superior, ahead, secular, as opposed to the Arabs who wanted to maintain their tribal, religious-centric identity. These clash then became to a crescendo in 1979 when suddenly the Ayatollahs came in and said, no, not only we are superior, we've been God-given a mandate to rule you. Saudi Arabia must go. Some of the tensions between Iran and the Saudis was the fact that Khomeini and Khamenei both are on our record to say that this family that is ruling Saudi Arabia is ungodly. We must get rid of them. because they rule the house of God, a reference to Mecca. This is our mission to do. And of course, then they had the Zionist group coming in Israel. They said, okay, we must sequence this. We must first get rid of the Zionists before we attack the Saudis. But they didn't stop attacking. 3-4 years ago, they sent missiles to some of the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. They started arming the Houthis against the Saudis in Yemen. So this new Iran, so to speak, or Iranian regime, post-1979, started challenging and exporting its Islamic ideology first to Iraq, then wanted to attack Saudi Arabia. They didn't want to directly. They went through Yemen. And of course, they attacked Pakistan, which is their eastern neighbor. And they threw some missiles there. So they have been a source of disruption. And their methodology in dominating the Arab world, or in their strategic objective of dominating the Islamic world, was to first get rid of the Zionist regime. How do you do it? You start proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. Basically, you create a crescent of resistance, or a crescent of fire, if you like, around this Zionist little state, and push them into the sea, as they say. And then, of course, the rest of that is as they say, is history. That's axis of what George Bush referred to as axis of evil. Khamenei and Iranian regime referred to it as the axis of resistance, as a holy mission that they have. So that the tension between the Arab world and Iranian regime, not with the Iranian society, at present and since 1971, has been primarily no longer on identity or cultural superiority, but on religious dominance. Who is going to be the dominant representative and the leader of the Islamic world? The Shias in Iran, they believe they are a God-given mandate, and the Saudis and others believe differently.
So that sort of sketches the messy picture that we live with today. Now, let's go back to the current protests, and then we'll ease into where South Africa has found itself. This is not the first protest in Iran. We know that just a few years ago, there was the protest where a young lady was murdered by the regime because she refused to wear a hijab. And there have been, in many years, many Iranians that have tried to stand up to the regime, and there have been protests that have broken out and always end in a similar fashion. Do you see this protest as being any different, or do you think that the regime will get on top of it and squash it, as they seem to be intent on doing it, by sending everybody quietly back home?
Yes, Mark, I think that is the unknown at the moment, to be honest, and that depends on a couple of variables I'll come back to. The importance of what we observed over the past 2 weeks, going now to week 3, is that for the first time since 1980, where we've had every 3-4 years an issue-related uprising. The first issue was the rights of women, which has remained a constant. Then there was the issue of electoral integrity. Then there was the issue of vote counting. Then on the issue of petrol. Then there was the issue of women, again back to 2022, where the late murdered Mahsa Amini became the symbol of opposition. So every time, this has been an evolution of uprising and social learning against the regime that, on the one hand, it has continuously and unstoppably lost its legitimacy. And that is undeniable by their own admissions, by statistics that we have, by the level of participation. So on the one hand, the regime has been losing steadily its legitimacy, its effectiveness, in part because they've spent almost all national resources of Iran on Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in North and West Africa, in Yemen, and at home, spending it on a very narrow 2 projects, nuclear projects and missiles. Now, what got left out is food production. What got left out is urban amenities. What got left out is water and electricity and gas and fuel. Believe it or not, Iran has the second largest known reserves of oil and natural gas, is short of gas, is short of petrol, etc., etc. So what got left out is attention to education and health. As we speak, many nurses retired and working, their salaries are not paid. Teachers are in revolt because their salaries are not paid, and government spend resources more and more on at home on security, maintaining the regime in a brutal way. As you referred to, every time that there's an uprising, they unleash unashamedly some or other mix of security against those who they see as disruptors. So at home, the national resources have been spent on security and on nuclear and on weapon development at the expense of everything else, literally. Outside, they've spent the resources in billions of dollars in those proxy disruptive forces in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, West Africa, North Africa, Algeria, etc., etc. So as a result, over time, not only they have lost legitimacy, but they have left the nation in an extremely unequal and unsustainable social configuration, where, for example, 1/3 of, it may come as a surprise, it's shocking for me as an economist to even think about it, that Iran would ever have 1/3 of its people, by the admission of the Minister of National Welfare, short of their daily food intake. This is a nation that, when I left, its per capita income was better than South Korea. We had excess of everything. Inflation was high because people had too much to spend. Working class unemployment was close to zero. We were importing professionals and working class. So, be as it may, the mismanagement of economic resources meant that 40 years later, now people can see that the government has got not only legitimacy problem, but also it's got management crisis and management of resources. The largest lake, Mike, in Iran, in northwest of the country, is now dried up because the water resources, the tributary rivers, were badly managed. This you cannot hide. You cannot tell people that you must trust God when they don't have bread on the table. And year after year, whether they are progressive religious or conservative, the result for the lived reality of people was the same. They're getting poorer and poorer, and a very small group of religious leaders, mullahs, are getting fatter and fatter, richer and richer. Their families are in Switzerland, Canada, France, the UK, and the rest of the population is living in misery. Then comes this year, 2-3 weeks ago, where the Trump and the United Nations snapback sanctions against Iran throws the currency into a complete tailspin. Within 5 days, the currency loses 46% of its value. The trade in Iran comes to a standstill because you cannot sell, because whatever you want to import will be now 1.5 times more expensive. People lose their jobs, and therefore the groundswell of, for the first time, Mike, the bazaris, who are the wholesale trade investor backbone of the conservative mullahs, they see that their wealth disappears daily, hourly, in front of their eyes, and they can't do trade. So they were the first to come out and express concern, go on a strike, put the deputy minister of finance and governor and the president on notice, and it got into a tailspin. From the bazaris and wholesalers went to the universities, from universities to retailers. Every group then suddenly coalesced because now suddenly it was not a rich and poor story. It wasn't a student intellectual as opposed to working class. Everybody felt that within 5 hours, everything went up, 5 days, everything went up by 30%, 40%, 50%, medicine went up 80% and unavailable because nobody wanted to sell, even those who had items. So this became 3 weeks ago a reality that Iran hadn't experienced. This time wasn't about women's rights or youth participation or proper counting of the votes. The social condition all of a sudden was like a wildfire covering all the strata of the society, intellectually, commercially, culturally, everything else. And it led to almost like a spontaneous kind of revolution, uprising, driven by initially by the sudden collapse of the currency and shortage of basic items and shortage of medicine and prices that nobody could afford, even the higher middle class couldn't afford it. Then suddenly, on the back of 30, 40 years of successive occasional uprising, somehow the society realized that this is no longer about an issue, it's about a regime that under all conditions is incapable of giving them a future. So the slogan developed that Iranians have been faced with two options: die slowly or go into the street and bare hand push the regime out and die with a bullet. And guess what, Mark? To my absolute surprise, literally I shiver when I look at what this youth, women and men, these are 15-year-old, 18-year-old, 20-year-old. I listened to them and they said, our parents, my generation, they made a mistake of choosing a slow death. We can't. I cannot accept that future. I'd rather die now and die once than die over the next 40, 50, 30, however many years. This is the reality that we face. Of course, there are other issues that we can go to in terms of geopolitics of the globe, the role of Israel, the attack that they had in June last year, America and Trump coming. We can go to further behind that during the elective years of American elections. Twice the Iranian regime engineered assassination against, both of them unsuccessful, against Trump. So there are all those side shows as well going internationally. But nationally, it's a very simple story. People have realized in mass, up to 90%, some people say 80%, be my guess, I don't know. Somewhere between 80 to 90% of people have realized that they have absolutely no future in terms of not social liberties and cultural independence, but also sheer survival of daily bread if this regime continues. Therefore, the slogan that at the moment binds everybody, which is very different from the past, is the regime must go, the dictator must fall, the ayatollahs must wrap up and leave the country.
Yeah, that water shortage is quite the story, because it seems like pretty soon Tehran is going to be uninhabitable. It literally has no water source, and that is by far the biggest city in Iran.
Yeah.
Iraj, I want to talk about the link between the new South Africa and Iran. Where did this suddenly come from? Because certainly the Ayatollahs, if one goes back to the struggle era in South Africa, the Ayatollahs weren't part of the landscape in South Africa. There was no link historically between the ANC and Iran. There was no link between any of our liberation movements and Iran. It was, the Soviet Union in some cases, in some African countries, even Chinese assistance or Western support. Iran was not on the radar screen. Suddenly, over the recent past, we've seen this great friendship develop. This great friendship which led to our head of the South African National Defence Force pledging allegiance and soldiers to the Ayatollahs in Tehran, clinking glasses with the regime, saying, "We're here, just call us." I think if anything must have frightened the Ayatollahs, it would have been the chance of having SANDF soldiers fighting side by side with them. But where does this sudden friendship and love affair come from? Because it wasn't there not even 10 years ago, as far as I can make out.
It's been slowly brewing. It's been a very calculated process. Its genesis, Mike, goes back to the early 1980s, 82, 83, 84, during which time Iran-Iraq war was at play. Those were the dying days of apartheid at the same time. Despite the historic link between the Shah and South Africa. As you might know, the Shah's father was banished by the British to South Africa, lived in Johannesburg, and he died there, and so on and so forth. So the link was between South Africa and Iran to the extent that the Shah invested, if my memory serves me correct, 17% of Sasol's coal to fuel conversion investment was done by the Iranian government under the Shah. So then comes late 1989s and early 1990s, and Iran and South Africa transitions to new dispensation, and the Iranian government or the mullahs are pretty much well settled in their ambition to export their theology, their world domination of this particular interpretation that I mentioned earlier on by the Shias. And they started establishing centers of education, call it conversion, call it radicalization, whatever is the terminology you prefer, in big time, not just in Middle East, but also in Africa. They started in Algeria first. Then they started sending missionaries, religious missionaries, not ambassadors. These were in competition with the Sunnis that were also investing heavily in South Africa by Saudis and by the Turks. Different orientation of Islamic faith. And Iranians started sending delegations every year to assess the receptivity of the population to their interpretation of Islam. And they had some success, but not terribly. The Mandela regime was fairly, let's say, suspicious, not supportive. At the UN resolutions, President Mandela opposed the Iranian human rights, etc., etc. Under Mbeki got a little bit more mellowed. South Africa wouldn't support the Iranian, but wouldn't oppose them either. By that time, the relationship in the background had developed between the Islamic Republic functionaries and the political, mostly ANC functionaries, through the ambassadors who developed this kind of relationships. And then came the birth of new cell phone industry, and MTN was born. And MTN was keen to penetrate wherever they could in global expansion. And two countries were targeted. One was Iran and one was Syria. And in that process, a lot of give and take took place. Call it corruption, call it favor, call it whatever. The strategic structure. And therefore, it sort of escalated to a different level. Iran at the same time was pursuing its nuclear ambitions in order to wipe out Israel and become a nuclear player globally, and was desperately looking for minerals that are needed. Magnesium, manganese, all kinds of inputs, and was very active and investing heavily in finding ways and means of accessing these minerals. And of course, accessing the technology, which eventually they did not succeed. They gave up on accessing nuclear technology, more specifically nuclear bomb technology. From South Africa, they shifted and they obtained it from Pakistan, from Professor Khan. But be as it may, so this is the answer to your question is it wasn't an event, it wasn't a personality, it was a kind of evolving multidimensional process. For example, the ANC ideologically, let's call it, was very much suspicious of the West, did not have a good relationship during anti-apartheid years with the West, but it had good relationship with Russia, with China, etc. And in essence, the enemy as my enemy is my friend kicked in. Iran suddenly was the enemy of America and the West on theological ground. But South African ANC ideologues were also suspicious of the West, and they were gravitating towards Iran because Iran was the enemy of their ideological enemy. And it became a friend of their ideological friend, Russia, most importantly. So again, it evolved. It wasn't a switch. It was a process filled with MTN as the catalyst, corruption on the back of it, favoritism and economic benefits of different kinds and shapes. At the same time, Mike, and this is the last point on it because it's so complex, during the Shah, Iran had invested in oil depository reserves in Saldanha Bay for strategic reasons, which was the backbone of OPEC and access to quick reserves, etc., etc. That was under apartheid. When the new government came in, suddenly they realized that, wow, Iran has 17% of Eskom that eventually, not Eskom, Sasol, that eventually they sold it to BP, but those reserves stayed intact, those oil reserves. In this process that I just briefly explained, Iran said, well, we are under sanction, but we can actually use those reserves. So there were deals done there that I do not know the details. I know the deals were done, but who did and who benefited? If you remember, sometimes not so long ago, there was a big halabula and exposure of the sale of oil strategic reserves at below market price that some people handsomely benefited from. Now, a lot of those facilitators were going between the ANC ministers and the Iranian regime. I do not know more than that, but I know there was a lot happening there.
Now, Iraj, there was a lot of speculation that the timeline looks incredibly suspicious. In December of 2022, the ANC has financial problems. Was it 2023, whenever it was? Has real financial problems, facing a lawsuit, can't pay salaries. In the January, they take Israel to the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. And there was suddenly the ANC no longer has a financial problem. They pay salaries and they can fight an election. It was the end of 23 into 2024. And there was a lot of talk that the Iranian regime had sponsored that exercise of taking Israel to the ICJ. Do you think that's something, conspiracy theory, or do you think there's something to that?
I have no evidence, Mark, to be able to say yes or no. But what I can believe that this is the modus operandi of the Iranian regime. It has done the same thing in Iraq. It has done the same thing in Lebanon. It's done the same thing up until recently in Venezuela. It's done the same thing and is doing it in Yemen. In other words, find those who are politically capable, ideally in charge, and yet for some or other reason strapped financially, technologically, and get involved, support them towards your own ideals and ambitions. I cannot say it happened. I have no documents. I cannot say it didn't happen. The ANC, as to the best of my knowledge, hasn't really come up with anything which convinces everybody otherwise. And also, very importantly, in that time that you mentioned, the promotion of Iran into BRICS, promoted by South Africa as a chair, championed by primarily Minister of International Relations, Dr. Pander, gave more credence to this conspiracy theory or this possibility. That's unfortunately one of the cases that only honest disclosure of truth can tell us conclusively. But a lot of analysts in Iran have the same kind of, when I listen to their arguments, to their podcast, they are very much on the same page that many South Africans, that not only Iran paid South Africa to take Israel to the court, but more than that, South Africa remained during that time and prior to that completely silent when the Iranian regime was killing Syrians in tens of thousands. A total of over 700,000 were killed by the Iranian Islamic IRC Revolutionary Guards. And that's a matter of... So there is a lot of complex relationships there. And then MTN went to Syria and eventually lost billions and left. As we speak, MTN is still stuck in Iran. So can it be credible? Yes, unless we see contrary evidence from either the Iranian side or the ANC side, it's a credible hypothesis. No more than that.
Let's say that the ANC have strictly denied this, and at the same time that they're taking Israel to ICJ, they were saying nothing about the ongoing civil war in the Sudan. So,
or Syria,
or Syria.
For Syria, it wasn't about human
where we are now, Iraj, and that is that we've got Donald Trump tub thumping. He's really sort of on a roll. He's got rid of Maduro in Venezuela. He says that Iran is next, but the stakes are considerably higher. Militarily, Venezuela was in almost free fall in terms of their military capacity, and it's quite close to the US. Do you see them carrying out any kind of military action in Iran? There are some complexities, there's question marks as to how advanced the Iranian nuclear program is. And as we've seen from the Ukrainian war, Iran, if there's one industry that has seemed to have grown over the recent past, has been their weapons industry, where they have provided God knows how many drones to Russia.
Look, some kind of confrontation is inevitable, both on the basis of the fact that American interest in the region very much depends on a different kind of regime in Iran. America has to decide, do they pay the price slowly? Remember, the Iranian young would say, do we die slowly or do we die with one bullet? Americans have to do the same thing. Unfortunately, Obama in 2015, Biden 6-8 years later, they made horrendous strategic errors. They paid for this regime to survive. And again, I'm not accusing them. It's on the web. You can see what Obama himself now says. It was the single largest error of his presidency, filling a whole 747 jumbo plane with cash delivered to Tehran under his instruction. But be as it may, Americans have a choice. The security of their investments in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Israel, their strategic interest in Turkey, in Azerbaijan, Armanistan. And remember, they recently, President Trump engineered, if you like, or mediated between Armanistan and Azerbaijan, a peace that's been impossible for decades. So he has interest in the northwest part of Iran. He has interest in the Persian Gulf. all allies of the United States with their 2 bases there, one in Qatar, one in Kuwait. And these bases are vulnerable. And Iran has not shied away from saying, you must leave the region. Not only we want to push Israel into the sea, but we also want to gently but unstoppably push America. Now, other presidents in the United States have been sort of give and take, buying time and trying to resolve it diplomatically. President Trump seemed to be a different type, and he doesn't abide by the conventional rules. He has his own unconventional means, and he has to, in the next 3 days, decide. Does he want to play, or what, does America want to play a price slowly over time? At the same time, go down in history exactly the way that Obama went in 2015. Iran and Iranians were up in arms in the streets, shouting in their slogans, Obama, you are either with us or with the regime. And Obama went on down in history having sided with the regime against human rights and citizens' rights, against women's rights and every other normal rights. That is the legacy of Obama, unfortunately. Trump has to decide exactly on that. How will he be judged as an American president? Will he go down as the ones who watched 12,000 people being killed in 48 hours and do nothing about it, and maintain the 2 bases in the Middle East vulnerable? This is American assets. These are American citizens. Already about 600 of them killed by these very proxies of this regime. He has to fight it out, and you can see he wanted not to be the president that causes war, but he also knows that his choices are very, very stark, and 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. My own view is that he has no choice but to do something, and of the options that he has in the next 24 hours, he'll choose one. But the choice of doing nothing is, for me, it's impossible for him. From an Iranian revolutionary people who have died already in thousands, they have another moral contestation. They are not fighting for Trump. They are not fighting for Netanyahu. They are not fighting for Zionism. They are fighting for life, for human rights, for their lives. But if Israel and US attacks the regime, if it had attacked 10 days ago, they would have been seen as the functionaries, as the paid mercenaries of those regimes. Now, nobody believes that. The extent of uprising, the coalition of all kinds of groups, as I mentioned to you, has ruled out that justification for the regime. Although the regime keeps repeating that, no, we killed them because they were all armed by Israel and they were sent in by Trump. That doesn't wash. So yes. President Trump has a big choice, a very, very difficult choice to make in the next 24 hours.
Lastly, if South Africa, we perhaps not knowing how the year was going to kick off, thought it would be a good idea to have naval exercises that were led by China, but included Russia and Iran, despite the fact that even then they could have understood that it might be diplomatically fraught, but that was probably organized well in advance and probably by some people who were quite happy with that decision. The question is, we've seen allegedly our President Ramaphosa trying to get the Iranians to, please, if you don't mind, please go home. You're sensing a bit of nervousness. How nervous should the South African government feel right now in the face of their support for the Iranian regime?
For me, Mike, if I was sitting on a board of directors of South Africa with a huge fiduciary responsibilities, I would say, whether it happens this week, next year, or the year after, this regime is doomed by its own actions to failure. Which means whoever comes in Iran, whether it's a monarchy, constitutional monarchy, a Republican president, doesn't matter. it will be difficult for the Iranian nations and for its incoming legitimate government to not see the complicity of MTN in the murder of people in thousands, not just this year, over the past 20 years. And it's recorded, it's in the courts. It would be difficult to deny or justify that out of all governments on the planet, and I'm saying it without fear of contradiction, of all constitutions on the planet, the South African constitution is one that rejects categorically prejudices against women, stepping on human rights, social rights, right to demonstrate, etc., 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 all of which are completely against the ideals and the practices of the Islamic Republic, not against the Iranian nation, but against the Islamic Republic, with whom, out of all these times now, last year and over the past 3 years, the South African government has decided to become buddy-buddy and close friends, ideologically align itself. It's not as if we're living in 1980s that nobody knew the nature and the reality of this regime. We're now talking about 2022, 23, 25, 26, where everything is in the media. You need a minister or whoever does the research, strategic research, to just scan the web, and you'll see the United Nations reports on crime against humanity by this Iranian regime. You can see an existing sitting committee documenting case by case atrocities carried out against the Iranian political activists. You can see 47 years, no single group in Iran has been given the right to demonstrate for their social rights. Now, these are all embedded in our constitution, and our government, as I understand, takes its mandate to implement the constitution, not to go against it. Now, the Iranian people and whichever government comes in, whether next week or next year or the year after in Iran, is going to hold the South African government and MTN responsible for complicity in these crimes. These crimes are not little crimes. Holocaust was a reality that took 100 years for compensation to be claimed from countries, from corporations, from people who were involved. Is it not true? That's a fact up to today. Now, the Iranian intelligentsia and political movements, I'm not talking about the regime, I'm talking about the anti-regime that sooner or later they will take charge. They're going to go after MTN, they are going to go after South Africa for its complicity at the time that all the facts and realities of Islamic Republic was known. Not at the time that it was a speculation or at the time that United Nations was neither here nor there. I find it absolutely mind-boggling that South Africa, that champions multilateralism, that continuously makes reference to the need for multilateralism and going through the United Nations, is one of the only few nations that goes against the pronouncement of the United Nations, not in one, but many reports where Iran and the Iranian regime, not Iran, Iranian regime is seen as complicit and actively involved in the atrocities against human rights, violation of human beings, execution of its citizens. No other nation, other than exceptionally perhaps in Syria, where Bashir exposed its own or attacked its nation with chemical weapons. The Iranian regime is the second regime now that over the past few days has turned against its own nation using military Caspers, automatic weapons against teenagers who bear hand, against women and children. So I think these facts are going to come up sooner or later. And my plea to the South African government and to our international affairs is please take this thing seriously, and MTN board of directors need to take sooner or later real decision about how long they want to associate themselves with a murderous and violation of human rights, as not said by me or by others, by the United Nations.
Yeah. And we must remember who was once chairman of MTN when they had that investment, and that was one Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa, before he got into politics, where he was chairman of the MTN board. A lot to be said there. You know, actions have consequences, as we've seen. We saw Nicolas Maduro taunting Donald Trump, saying, "Come on, you coward, come and get me." Well, eventually he got you. We're in a very different world of diplomacy, and a whole new world. And a big topic like Iran needs a big explanation, and it's been provided for today by Dr. Iraj Abedian. And I want to thank him so much for doing this job in demystifying where Iran is and what has got us to this position. So thank you to Dr. Abedian, to everybody that watched us. Please support Pace Car Rental. Go rent a car there. Please support the State of the Nation by subscribing to the channel. And we will see you again soon. Thank you very much for today.
Thank you.